two unlikely pilots help end World War II.
Gentlemen, when we met at Wendover for the first time about 10 months ago, I told you at that time that I had great hopes that the mission that we were about to undertake could end the war. At the same time, I offered to release any man who felt that he could not work under the conditions of mystery and possible danger that might prevail. That offer still goes, because this bomb that you're going to use is not an ordinary bomb. It's not a 1,000-pounder. It's not a 10-ton blockbuster. This bomb has the strength of 20,000 tons of TNT.
You probably have heard the story of the B-29 and how Colonel Paul Tibbets piloted the plane over Japan during World War II and dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. What you probably haven't heard is how Tibbets, with the help of two unlikely pilots, convinced nervous and skeptical American Army aviators that the troubled plane wasn't a death trap, a flying coffin, as they believed. Let me tell you the story. It begins with the tragic World War II crash of a top-secret B-29 bomber during its early testing days. It was a crash that struck fear into the heads of even the country's bravest flyers and could have delayed the end of the war by months, if not years. Just after noon, February 18, 1943, Chief Test Pilot Edmund "Eddie" Allen pushed the throttle to full. His prototype B-29 Fortress bomber began to roar down the runway at Seattle, Washington's Boeing Field. At just the right moment, he pulled back on the yoke and the monster airplane began to climb. His crew of 10 men went to work, each tasked with evaluating the aircraft's performance. 47-year-old Eddie was one of the most respected aviators and test pilots in the entire country. From his early days as a World War I flight instructor for the Army, and on through his appointment in 1939 as the head of Boeing's Aircraft Research Division, Eddie tested many new and experimental aircraft. It was a great-looking late winter day for flying in Seattle, clear, with light winds and scattered high clouds. Eddie was well acquainted with the B-29. He had first-hand knowledge of its many engine and leaking fuel problems. His bomber today was the second prototype, and Eddie had successfully, but barely, survived piloting its very first flight when one of its engines suddenly caught fire and began spreading. Eddie was lucky to land in time. This Seattle flight was the aircraft's 8th since that fire. Less than 25 miles south of the field, fire erupted in an engine on the left wing side of the plane. Eddie immediately killed the engine, and the crew apparently successfully put out the fire. Now, not willing to take any more chances, Eddie turned north and headed back to the field. On the way back, the engine caught fire again, but it was small and easily controlled. 5 miles from landing, there was some sort of explosion that could be heard all the way down to the ground. Metal parts began dropping from the plane, and the B-29 was losing altitude. "I thought he was going to try to land at the airport or a cow pasture somewhere," said an eyewitness. "It looked as if there was only one motor that was running, the right side motor. Now, the left outside motor appeared to explode right in the air. Either the propeller flew apart or maybe part of the motor, I guess. There were lots of parts in the air that were just falling down everywhere. It looked like the pilot was trying to gun the motors, but they just wouldn't gun. They just coughed and coughed." With 2 motors now burning, the plane broke through power lines and slammed into the Fry meat processing plant, the city's largest. There was a huge explosion, followed by a fire of at least 100 feet in width and throwing flames of up to 50 feet into the air. Eyewitness accounts vary slightly, but most had seen 2 or perhaps 3 men attempt to jump from the plane before it crashed. "Their parachutes seemed to open," said one truck driver. "But it was too late to do 'em any good. They never had a chance. Now, I saw that plane crash into the packing house. There was a small flame and then a big explosion, probably gasoline. That's when I started to run. The flame shot up about 200 feet directly over our heads as I ran to the fire alarm box. Now, two men were hanging from a steel window frame outside of the packing plant. Flames were shooting out of the window right over their heads. I ran to the street, and I met the hook and ladder truck as it came and told them about the two men. Well, the firemen immediately put up a ladder, and thankfully they rescued them." Just 20 minutes after takeoff and about 3 miles south of Boeing Field, the 4-engine B-29 monster had dropped and pancaked into a fiery mass onto the 5-story Fry Packing Company building. The loud explosion was heard miles away as it echoed across the Seattle Sound. Edmund Eddie Allen and his 10-man B-29 crew were all dead. At least 29 workers in the plant were crushed and likely killed instantly. It took nearly a week to recover all of the bodies, and the death toll rose to 32. Only about 30 men were still alive and rescued, and it could have been worse. Had the crash occurred just a few minutes later, the plant's workers, who were still on their lunch hour at the time, would have returned and been working inside when it came down. Investigators believe that a fuel line had burst in the bomber, spewing gasoline onto hot engine parts and reigniting the original small engine fire. It was back to the drawing board for the Boeing engineers, and after months of redesign and modifications, of the first 100 B-29s produced, fewer than 20 were even airworthy. The rumors and stories spread among the pilots and crews. The B-29, they said, was a flying coffin. Not only were there fires while in the air, fires even started when the pilots were on the ground and going through their pre-flight checklist. Most believe that the aircraft production had just been rushed too much. The chief of the Army Air Forces, General Henry Hap Arnold, was desperate to get the B-29 flying missions over Japan just as quickly as possible, and he needed an experienced, war-tested bomber pilot and engineer to lead that effort. After completing 25 bombing missions in Europe, 28-year-old Colonel Paul Tibbets, considered perhaps the best pilot in the Army, was ordered home to supervise the B-29 project. For a year, Tibbets flew the Superfortress, evaluating its strengths and its weaknesses so that he could transition Army pilots into flying the bomber. But pilots' resistance to what they considered a potential death assignment continued to frustrate his efforts. "Oh, I heard stories," he said, "to the effect that this airplane is really a dangerous airplane to fly. If you lose an engine, it's going to crash, so on, so on." They had a psychological fear of that airplane. Tibbets remembered seeing a woman Air Force Service pilot, a WASP, land a P-47 fighter at a time when that aircraft was still thought to be just about as dangerous as the B-29. Well, I looked at this maybe 110-pound brunette, and I thought to myself, why are we crashing them? Yet this little girl had no problem flying that thing at all. Tibbets had an idea, and he took it to his commander. I told him the reason we have this problem is we have a bunch of college football stars who think that plane is unsafe. I said, if you let me train 2 women to fly the B-29, I'll show those men that this plane is safe. Tibbets got the okay and met with 2 WASP pilots, Dora Doherty and her friend Dorothea Dee Johnson. Dora was the pilot he had seen land that P-47. She was 22 and Dee was 26. Tibbets asked them if they'd ever flown a 4-engine airplane, and he was happy to hear that both said no. It was the perfect answer to show any pilot, especially the men, that with training, anyone could fly the B-29. He took them to Birmingham, Alabama, where a number of B-29s were based. "I wondered if I'd be strong enough to fly her," Dora said. "Would my hand be big enough to maneuver the 4 throttles?" In less than a week of intense instruction, Tibbets convinced the women that they could fly the monster. He had ordered a new B-29 outfitted for demonstration flights. Now this plane was emblazoned with the name Ladybird, right next to an image of Fifinella, the Wasp pilot's mascot. In mid-June 1944, with Dora in the pilot's seat and Dee Dee as co-pilot, they were ready. "It was enormous," Dora said. "The pilot and the co-pilot were a good distance from each other, and the flight engineer was behind you. Now, he had all the gauges, so if you needed to know what the RPM was, well, you had to turn around and ask him." She taxied the plane into position and called the tower for takeoff clearance. The operator told her he couldn't talk to her right now because he had a B-29 on the runway that was all ready to go. "That's me," Dora said. Just before they made that first landing, Tibbets joked to Dora, "You bounce this thing and you're dead." The touchdown was smooth, and the women let out a sigh of relief. Now they flew to New Mexico, where they began flying 4 pilots at a time on flights that would show them what the B-29 could do, even flying with one of the engines shut down. One officer threatened to quit rather than fly with a woman, Dee Dee said. The first quartet was hesitant, but the second group was more trusting. "On that first trip, they all wore parachutes," Dora said. "Yes," said Dee Dee, "but the second day they didn't." Tibbets and the women had proved their point, and at the same time, they began ruffling some feathers. Word came down from Army headquarters to stop the demonstration flights immediately. It was one thing to prove that any pilot could learn to fly the Superfortress, but "Those 2 women are putting our men to shame." Dora and Dee Dee never flew the B-29 again. Dee Dee finished her time with the Wasp and married an Army pilot, Henry Mormon. Dora continued to work with Paul Tibbets until he left for Japan, piloting a B-29, the Enola Gay, with a crew that dropped the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima.
Saw this cloud of boiling dust and debris below us with this tremendous mushroom on top. Beneath that was hidden the ruins of the city of Hiroshima.
Because Japan refused to surrender, Colonel Charles Sweeney, flying a second B-29, dropped a second bomb on Nagasaki, effectively ending World War II. Thanks for watching. Hey, we'll see you real soon with something brand new. Now don't forget to subscribe and maybe give us a thumbs up. Have a great day and an even better tomorrow.